The American's Tale by Arthur Conan Doyle. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Denis Gagne. The American's Tale by Arthur Conan Doyle. "It air strange, it air," he was saying as I opened the door of the room to where our social little semi-literary society met. "But I could tell you queerer things than that 'ere. Almighty queer things. You can't learn everything out of books, sirs, nohow. You see, it ain't the men as can string English together and has had good education as find themselves in the queer places I've been in. They're mostly rough men, sirs, as can scarce speak aright, far less tell with pen and ink than the things they've seen. But if they could, they'd make some of you Europeans' hair riz with astonishment. They were, sirs, you bet." His name was Jefferson Adams, I believe. I know his initials were J.A., for you may see them yet deeply whittled on the right-hand upper panel of our smoking-room door. He left us this legacy, and also some artistic patterns done in tobacco juice upon our turkey carpet. But beyond these reminiscences, our American storyteller has vanished from our ken. He gleamed across our ordinary, quiet conviviality, like some brilliant meteor, and then was lost in the outer darkness. That night, however, our Nevada friend was in full swing, and I quietly lit my pipe and dropped into the nearest chair, anxious not to interrupt his story. "Mind you," he continued, "I ain't got no grudge against your men of science. I likes and respect a chap as can match every beast and plant, from a huckleberry to a grizzly with a jaw-breaking name. But if you wants real interesting facts, something a bit juicy, you go to your whalers, your frontiersmen, your scouts, and Hudson Bay men, chaps who mostly can scarce sign their names." There was a pause here as Mr. Jefferson Adams produced a long cheroot and lit it. We preserved a strict silence in the room, for we had already learned that on the slightest interruption our Yankee drew himself into his shell again. He glanced around with a self-satisfied smile as he remarked our expectant looks, and continued through a halo of smoke. "Now, which of you gentlemen has ever been in Arizona? None, I'll warrant. And of all English or Americans as can put pen to paper, how many has been in Arizona? Precious few, I calculate. I've been there, sirs, lived there for years, and when I think of what I've seen there, why, I can scarce get myself to believe it now. Ah, there's a country. I was one of Walker's filibusters, as they chose to call us, and after we'd busted up and the chief was shot, some of us made tracks and located down there. A regular English and American colony we was, with our wives and children, and all complete. I reckon there's some of the old folk there yet, and that they ain't forgotten what I'm going to tell you. No, I warrant they ain't. Never on this side of the grave, sirs. I was talking about the country, though, and I guess I could astonish you considerable if I spoke of nothing else. To think of such a land being built for a few greasers and half-breeds. It's a misusing of the gift of Providence, that's what I calls it. Grass is hung over a chap's head as he rode through it, and trees so thick that you couldn't catch a glimpse of blue sky for leagues and leagues, and orchids like umbrellas. Maybe some on you has seen a plant that they calls the flycatcher in some parts of the States?" "Diona muscipula," murmured Dawson, our scientific man par excellence. "Ah, Diana municipal, that's him. You'll see a fly stand on that air plant, and then you'll see the two sides of a leaf snap up together and catch it between them, and grind it up and mash it to bits, for all the world like some great sea squid with its beak, and hours after, if you open the leaf, you'll see the body lying half digested and in bits. Well, I've seen those flytraps in Arizona with leaves 8 and 10 feet long, and thorns or teeth a foot or more. Why, they could, but darn it, I'm going too fast. It's about the death of Joe Hawkins I was going to tell you. About as queer a thing, I reckon, as ever you heard tell on. There wasn't nobody in Montana as didn't know of Joe Hawkins, Alabama Joe as he was called there. A regular out-and-outer he was, by the darndest skunk as ever a man clapped eyes on. He was a good chap enough, mind ye, as long as you stroked him in the right way, but rile him anyhow, and he were worse nor a wildcat. I've seen him empty his six-shooter into a crowd as chanced to jostle him a-going into Simpson's bar when there was a dance on, and he bowied Tom Hooper 'cause he split his liquor over his whiskey by mistake. No, he didn't stick at murder, Joe didn't, and he weren't a man to be trusted further nor you could see him. Now at that time I tell on when Joe Hawkins was swaggering about the town and laying down the law with his shooting irons, there was an Englishman there the name of Scott, Tom Scott, if I reflects all right. This chap Scott was a thorough Britisher, begging the present company's pardon, and yet he didn't freeze much to the British set there, and they didn't freeze much to him. He was a quiet, simple man, Scott was, rather too quiet for a rough set like that. Sneaking, they called him, but he weren't that. He kept himself mostly apart and didn't interfere with nobody as long as he was left alone. Some said as how he'd been kinder ill-treated at home, been a chartist or something of that sort, and had to up stick and run, but he never spoke of it hisself and never complained. Bad luck or good, the chap kept a stiff lip on him. This chap Scott was a sort of bud among the men about Montana, for he was so quiet and simple-like. There was no part of either to take up his grievances, for as I've been saying, the Britishers hardly counted him one of them, and many a rough joke they played on him. He never cut up rough, but was polite to all hisself. I think the boys got to think he hadn't much grit in him until he showed 'em their mistake. It was in Simpson's bar as the row got up, and that led to the queer thing I was going to tell you of. Alabama Joe and one or two other rowdies were dead on the Britishers in those days, and they spoke their opinions pretty free, though I warned them as there'd be an almighty muss. That particular night Joe was nigh half drunk, and he swaggered about the town with his six-shooter, looking out for a quarrel. Then he turned into the bar where he knowed he'd find some of the English as ready for one as he was hisself. Sure enough, there was half a dozen lounging out, and Tom Scott standing alone before the stove. Joe sat down by the table and put his revolver and bowie down in front of him. "Them's my arguments, Jeff," he says to me. "If any white-livered Britisher dares give me the lie." I tried to stop him, sirs, but he weren't a man as you could easily turn, and he began to speak in a way as no chap could stand. Why, even a greaser would flare up if you said as much of Greaser land. There was a commotion at the bar, and every man laid his hands on his weapons. But before they could draw, we heard a quiet voice from the stove. "Say your prayers, Joe Hawkins, for by heaven you're a dead man." Joe turned around and looked like grabbing at his irons, but it weren't no matter of use. Tom Scott was standing up, covering him with his derringer, a smile on his white face, but the very devil shining in his eye. "It ain't that the old country has used me over well," he says, "but no man shall speak again it afore me and live." For a second or two I could see his fingers tighten around the trigger, and then he gave a laugh and threw the pistol on the floor. "No," he says, "I can't shoot a half-drunk man. Take your dirty life, Joe, and use it better nor you have done. You've been nearer to the grave this night than you will again until your time comes. You best make tracks now, I guess. Nay, never look black at me, man. I'm not afeard at your shooting iron. A bully's nigh always a coward." As he swung contemptuously around and relit his half-smoked pipe from the stove, while Alabama slunk out of the bar with the laughs of the Britishers ringing in his ears, I saw his face as he passed me, and on it I saw murder, sirs, murder, as plain as I'd ever seed anything in my life. I stayed in the bar after the row and watched Tom Scott as he shook hands with the men about. It seemed kind of queer to me to see him smiling and cheerful like, for I knew Joe's bloodthirsty mind, and that Englishman had small chance of ever seeing the morning. He lived in an out-of-the-way sort of place, you see, clean off the trail, and had to pass through the Fly-Trap Gulch to get it. This here gulch was a marshy, gloomy place, lonely enough during the day even, for it were always a creep sort of thing to see the great 8 and 10-foot leaves snapping up if I'd touch 'em. But at night there were never a soul near. Some parts of the marsh, too, were soft and deep, and a body thrown in would be gone by the morning. I could see Alabama Joe crouching under the leaves of the great fly trap in the darkest part of the gulch. with a scowl on his face and a revolver in his hands. I could see it, sir, as plain as day with my 2 eyes. About midnight, Simpson shuts up his bar, so out we had to go. Tom Scott started off for his 3-mile walk at a slashing pace. I just dropped him a hint as he passed me, for I kind of like the chap. "Keep your derringer loose in your belt, sir," I says, "for you might chance to need it." He looked around at me with his quiet smile, and then I lost sight of him in the gloom. I never thought to see him again. He'd hardly gone afore Simpson comes up to me and says, "There'll be a nice job at the Flytrap Gulch tonight, Jeff. The boy says Hawkins started half an hour ago to wait for Scott and shoot him on sight. I calculate the coroner'll be wanted tomorrow." What passed in the gulch that night, it were a question as were asked pretty free next morning. A half-breed was in Ferguson's store after daybreak, and he said as he'd chanced to be near the gulch about 1 in the morning. It weren't easy to get at his story. He seemed so uncommon scared. But he told us at last, as he'd heard the fearfulest screams in the stillness of the night. They weren't no shots, he said, but screams after scream, kinder muffled, like a man with a serape over his head and in mortal pain. Abner, Brandon, and me and a few more was in the store at the time, so we mounted and rode out to Scott's house, passing through the gulch on the way. There weren't nothing particular to be seen there, no blood nor marks of a fight, nor nothing. And when we gets up to Scott's house, he comes out to meet us as fresh as a lark. "Hello, Jeff," says he. "No need for the pistol after all. Come in, have a cocktail, boys." "Did you see or hear nothing as you came home last night?" says I. "No," says he. "All was quiet enough. An owl kinda moaning in the Flytrap Gulch, that was all. Come, jump off and have a glass." "Thank ye," said Abner. So off we gets, and Tom Scott rode into the settlement with us when we went back. An all-fired commotion was on in Main Street as we rode into it. The American party seemed to have gone clean crazed. Alabama Joe was gone, not a darn particle of him left. Since he went out in the gulch, nary an eye had seen him. As we got off our horses, there was a considerable crowd in front of Simpson's bar, and some ugly looks at Tom Scott, I can tell you. There was a clicking of pistols, and I saw as Scott had his hand in his bosom, too. There weren't a single English face about. "Stand aside, Jeff Adams," said Zeb Humphrey, as great a scoundrel as ever lived. "You hain't got no hand in this game. Say, boys, are we free Americans to be murdered by any darn Britisher?" It was the quickest thing I'd ever seed. There was a rush and a crack. Zeb was down, with Scott's ball in his thigh. Scott himself was on the ground with a dozen men holding him. There weren't no use struggling, so he lay quiet. They seemed a bit uncertain what to do with him, but then one of Alabama's special chums put them up to it. "Joe's gone," he said. "Nothing ain't sure nor that, and there lies the man as killed him. Some on you knows as Joe went on business to the gulch that night. He never came back. That 'ere Britisher passed through after he'd gone. They had a row. Scream is heard among the great fly traps. I say again, he played poor Joe some of his sneaking tricks and throw him into the swamp. Ain't no wonder as the body is gone. But are we to stand by and see English murdering our own chums? I guess not. Let Judge Lynch try him, that's what I say." "Lynch him!" shouted 100 angry voices, for all the rag, tag, and bobtail of the settlement was round us by this time. "Here, boys, fetch a rope and swing 'em up. Up with him over Simpson's door. See here, though," says another, coming forward. "Let's hang him by the great fly trap in the gulch. Let Joe see as he's revenge, if so be as he's buried by there." There was a shout for this, and away they went, with Scott tied on his Mustang in the middle, and a mounted guard with cocked revolvers round him. For we knew as there was a score or so Britishers about, as didn't seem to recognize Judge Lynch, and was dead on a free fight. I went out with him, my heart bleeding for Scott, though he didn't seem a cent put out, he didn't. He were game to the backbone. Seemed kind of queer, sirs, hanging a man to a fly trap. But ours were a regular tree, and the leaves like a brace of boats with a hinge between 'em and thorns at the bottom. We passed down the gulch to the place where the great one grows, and there we seed it with leaves, some open, some shut. But we seed something worse than that. Standing around the tree was some 30 men, Britishers all, and armed to the teeth. They was waiting for us evidently, and had a business-like look about 'em, as if they'd come for something and meant to have it. There was raw material there for about as warm a scrimmage as I'd ever seed. As we rode up, a great red-bearded Scotchman, Cameron were his name, stood out afore the rest, his revolver cocked in his hand. "See here, boys," he says, "you've got no call to hurt a hair off that man's head. You hain't proved as Joe is dead yet, and if you had, you hain't proved as Scott killed him. Anyhow, if it were in self-defense, for all you know, as he was lying in wait for Scott, to shoot him on sight. So I say again, you hain't got no call to hurt that man. And what's more, I've got 36 bailed arguments against how you're doing it." "It's an interesting point, worth arguing out," said the man, as was Alabama Joe's special chum. There was a clicking of pistols and a loosening of knives, and the two parties began to draw up on another, and it looked like a rise in the mortality of Montana. Scott was standing behind with the pistol at his ear if he stirred, looking quiet and composed as having no money on the table, when suddenly he gives a start and a shout as rang in our ears like a trumpet. "Joe!" he cried. "Joe, look at him in the fly-trap!" We all turned and looked where he was pointing. Jerusalem! I think we won't get that picture out of our minds again. One of the great leaves of the fly-trap that had been shut and touching the ground as it lay was slowly rolling back upon its hinges. There, lying like a child in its cradle, was Alabama Joe in the hollow of the leaf. The great thorn had been slowly driven through his heart as it shut upon him. We could see, as he tried to cut his way out, for there was a slit in the thick, fleshy leaf, and his bowie was in his hand, but it had smothered him first. He laid down on it, likely to keep the damp off while he were waiting for Scott, and it had closed on him as you've seen your little hothouse ones do on a fly, and there he were as we found him, torn and crushed into a pulp by the great jagged teeth of a man-eating plant. There, sirs, I think you'll own as that's a curious story. "And what became of Scott?" asked Jack Sinclair. "Well, we carried him back on our shoulders, we did, to Simpson's bar, and he stood liquors around us. Made a speech, too, a darn fine speech from the counter. Something about the British Lion and the American Eagle walking arm in arm forever and a day. And now, sirs, that yarn was long, and my cheroots out, so I reckon I'll make tracks afore it's later." And with a "good night," he left the room. "A most extraordinary narrative," said Dawson. "Who would have thought a Danoa had such power?" "Deuced rum yarn," said young Sinclair. "Evidently a matter-of-fact, truthful man," said the doctor. "Or the most original liar that ever lived," said I. "I wonder which he was." End of The American's Tale.